How many of y'all consider, and put a 1 in the chat if this is something that you consider to be true, okay? Put a 1 in the chat if it's the case that you think that ancient Egyptian culture was native African culture. Put a 2 in the chat if you think it was European or Mediterranean culture. If you think Egyptian civilization was African, put a 1 in the chat. If you think it was Mediterranean or it was, Caucasoid or, Asian or Oriental, put a 2 in the chat. Because, some people are, beginning to say that, black folks had no high civilization or no high culture. They only had, mud huts and plates in their noses and, scarification and all of this kind of stuff. It was, the only African culture that, black folks can make a claim to, especially in the Americas, or Israelite culture. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to anybody who believes this. Here's my thing, man. And let me just say this, right? Let's start off with the earliest dynasties, okay? So we're talking about old Egypt, or old, the old dynasties, the first. Normer. Was he African or was he Asian? I tend to believe, just looking at his physical characteristics, man, just looking at it, the guy looks like an Africoid man to me. But that's just my opinion. Then, not only that, you also have to understand that there's a genealogical connection between Nubia or Kush or Punt with Kemetic culture or Egyptian culture in general. So that's why I made reference to it earlier in one of my videos. But I had some people who came in and they said, well, the only culture we could actually claim is Israelite culture. And my question about it then is, and I don't mean to be offensive by saying this, but what evidence do we have beyond a book that Israelite culture ever existed? And I'm asking a question because perhaps maybe I'm not abreast of it or don't know about it. Maybe it's a theological question best left to scholars. Where is it? If you look at the hieroglyphs, the pyramids, the temples, you can see evidence of that culture. If you look at Greece and you see the Parthenon, you can see evidence of that culture. If you look at the Roman Colosseum, you can see evidence of that culture. Where's the evidence of the Hebrew culture? Where's the evidence of it? I'm talking about historical evidence. Where is it? Now, there are some people who would like to connect Hebrew culture to the Heribu, which there are references to in Egyptian hieroglyphs, okay? Some people would like to argue that Hebrew or Israelite culture is a splintering off of Kemetic culture by means of Akhenaten and its worship of the sun disk Aten and its, supposed monotheism. Okay? So there's connections there. Some people say it has to do with the Hyksos. Some warriors from the north who came in and invaded the territory. But the question is Kemetic culture essentially at its core African culture? That's what I'm asking. And my viewpoint on it is that essentially at its core, it is African culture. And the only thing I wanted to draw out and to put out there was that when you look at African culture, when you look at it, when you see it, when you understand it, you look at it, you see it, you see and let me put this out here, man. This is what you see, bro. You see the Holy Trinity, man. You see that. Osiris in the middle, Isis on the left, and Horus on the right. That's the family, man. Egyptian culture had mononuclear family structures. They didn't have their grandmas living with them. They didn't have their aunties living with them. Their cousins and them living with them. They had mononuclear families. That was the only thing I was trying to point out and to draw out. This is African culture, man. This is not European culture, not white culture, not Western culture. This is classical African culture in one of its most high stages. You can call it whatever you want to. You can say it's pagan, whatever the case may be. But at least what you see there is a mononuclear family where a man is being honored, not only by his wife, but also by his son. They're both honoring him. He is the center of it. He's not on the periphery somewhere. He's not an uncle daddy sitting on the sidelines wondering whether or not he could actually be involved. There is no court system preventing him from being involved. He is the center of family life. Now, yeah, it's true. Women in Kemet could get divorced, but it was rare. It wasn't common parlance. So there are some people now today who would make the argument or would try to make the case that, okay, well, we can't have fully intact families because the whole concept or the idea of a mononuclear family is a Western patriarchal tradition. Well, what about the classical African civilization that existed millennia ago? I'm talking about this civilization, one could argue, is damn near 4,000 to 5,000 years old. 4,000 to 5,000 years old. If they didn't have an issue with it, why we got such big issues with it? That's the question. I'm just asking the question. And that's the only point I'm trying to make. We're acting as if African culture, there was never a concept of the mononuclear family. Again, wasn't no big mama and them, grandma and them, aunties, cousins and them, all living in one hut or one house. No. That was not how the family was in that civilization. And most African civilizations. I'm just saying. Let's see if we got Doc Johnson up again, man. We got some technical difficulties solved, man. Doc Johnson, what's going on?
I'm good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
No, still hearing.
You still hear echo, bro? Maybe you might want to try something. Yeah, that's it's crushing me right there, Doc. I don't know what to say, man, because everything is good on my end. It's just your end.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I've never heard it before. Like, shit.
So the only thing I could do at this point, man, is try to determine, man, if let me see here, man. Maybe it's something on my end that's causing this. Now, I mean, let's see now. Do you hear echo now? Talk.
Let me see. No? Well, it's lower. It's lower.
It's lower?
Yeah. What did you just do?
I turned off something on my system, bro. So if that works.
So I'm coming into you and it might be coming back into your mic.
Okay.
Whatever you got me on might be coming back to your mic.
So everybody says everything is good now. If it sounds good now, you can hear him. Everything's good now, they say. So we're good. Okay. That was my issue. It wasn't your issue because I have Google Chrome also playing in on my system, and so that's probably where the echo came from. I apologize for all the technical difficulties that have ensued from doing today's show. I apologize, man. Okay, so Anyway, thank you for going through all of that trouble, man, to be here. And sorry for the issues, man. We are not a television broadcast station, so every now and then, there'll be some hiccups and all that, along the way, bro. But
Right.
so we wanted to have this conversation, man, and what I wanted to do was to present it in a more politically correct way than the way that I was going to talk about it, because I wanted to talk about it in a way. I wanted to say that black women love to play the role of mammy, and they like to play the role of sapphire.
Mm.
And my viewpoint on it is, look, a lot of black women are loud, disrespectful, violent, aggressive, scornful, disdainful, condescending, vulgar. And these are a few ways to describe the mammy or the sapphire. But not necessarily the mammy, but the sapphire. But these things become blended at certain points in United States history. Okay? But both the mammy and the sapphire know just how far to push the envelope. Because if they take things too far, they can find themselves at the end of a rope or attached to a whipping post.
Exactly.
Those are the facts. So you see that like women can be a little bit authoritarian in the context of white households if they were there, okay? If they were in those households, there was a certain latitude that black women had that, of course, black men did not have. Okay? You don't want a black man telling your kids, what to do harshly and in a condescending, or some sort of disdainful tone. You don't want that, because you're basically trying to emasculate men as much as you possibly can if they're outgroup men. Right? So, but another thing about the mammy is that she fawns, and has to, over the offspring of the white family. But oftentimes, the mammy is characterized as treating her own children pretty harshly. Right? So in other words, man, there's actions that the mammy could get away with in the white household, but black men couldn't, right? But then this question is, this is a unique relationship that black women were able to have with white boys, girls, men, and women. Because black women were often perceived as extensions of the white family. Now, there are going to be scholars who say, no, this is not true. This is not the case. This is just a mischaracterization of historical events. Okay? That, this is post-Reconstruction ideals about what black women were as they were domestics or house, slaves within the context of white plantation life. Now, I'm not so sure about this, man. Are we witnessing today the vestiges of this kind of culture in black women via the institutional arrangements that were established by slave culture? What do you think, man? I'm just asking the question, Doc.
Well, let me back up. I'm not sure what I missed for a moment when I had to check out. Would you tell them this was a two-parter today?
Yeah, this is okay. So yeah, let me let you know this, man. Today we doing two parts, man. I'm gonna follow Tiasan Johnson from this format to his format, and then we're gonna watch some clips of some videos, and then we're gonna comment about them. Okay. So you let them know also. Talk to them, right, and let them know.
So it's it's basically a continuation of the same subject, but we're dealing with, black women's behavior, black women's choices, and even some of the historical context leading up to it, as Brother Gigi is breaking down. But that said, I wanted to just add in so we're all on the same page. We remember that with the mammy archetype, right? She was not only abusive to her kids while adoring, adorizing white children, but she was also abusive to her men. She was the domineering matriarch, that stood in the exact oppositional framework as she did in the White household. So she was subservient in the White household, even though she had this emotional tie to the children she actually suckled, right? But when she came into her own community, she was domineering and exploitive to the children and the men. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic there. But tell me again, what was the question though?
So the question is, at the current moment, we know, like BGS has said this on various occasions, that a lot of black women, man, when they mate with black men or get themselves involved in intimate relationships with black men, it's often perceived by men as a Klingon mating ritual. Okay, it's as if we have to fight these women tooth and nail in order to gain respect.
Right.
But I mean, let black women tell it, especially post feminist, second wave feminism, right? That black men are sexist, abusive, domineering, controlling, and a whole host of negative adjectives and epithets, right? Mm-hmm. Such that, being with men like us is intolerable.
Right.
Right. And not only that, there aren't enough of us around who are worthy of being suitable life partners.
Exactly. Right.
So, I mean, which I think is patently false. Okay. Mm-hmm. But the question is, do you think that these attitudes that are exhibited by black women are vestiges of slave culture and the familial arrangements that were present during slavery? Is their genealogy connected with this aggressiveness, with the scornfulness, the disdainfulness, the disagreeableness? Is there a connection between these attributes and traits and slave culture? Or is it something that is relatively nascent, meaning it's brand new as a cultural phenomenon? Because even, prior to the advent of the programs of the Great Society, at least, black men and women were getting married to some degree. Even if it wasn't like a perfect situation, they were at least finding ways to get along because they needed each other in order to survive. Mm-hmm. Right now, what we find is a brand new phenomenon. Okay? Mm-hmm. Because the single mother rate has risen to, between 70 and 80%. And this is not a great or an optimal outcome for children. Okay? Mm-hmm. It might be good for individuals who want to pursue lives of conspicuous consumption and hedonism and want to enjoy all the accoutrements that come along with negative liberty in a liberal society. But the question is, what kind of cultural impact or effect does that have on progeny and the futurity of the black community? That's the question.
Well, there was a few elements that you asked. I'll try to catch all of them. I think when you ask, is this something that comes out of slavery or is it new? I think there are elements of both. I think there are elements that have continued from slavery, and I think there are elements that have been heightened and embellished upon with policy. And I think, and I've been saying this for the longest, policy in the last 50 years has had a lot to do with the changing behavior, expectations, and worldview of many black women. And that has directly impacted how they engage black men. So I think that, in terms of that question, there's both. As far as enslavement is concerned, I've done a couple of shows recently in the last month, with BGS, who's in the chat. Shout out to BGS, with attorney Dennis Sperling, and some of the things we talked about, and even yourself, right? We've talked about the numbers of black men enslaved in the Western Hemisphere. We know West African slavery. We know that the Arab slave trade, they emphasize more on women while making black men into eunuchs, making African men eunuchs. But in the Western Hemisphere was a different dynamic. They sought us out in greater numbers. So we didn't see significant numbers of black women until just before, about 60 years before the Civil War ended. So at the end of the day, we were kind of thrown together in a relatively short period of time and told we were a people. And I think all of this has had some bearing on our dynamic, because the paradigm of how we relate to one another starts fairly late in the game as far as slavery is concerned, from what I can see. And on plantations, for example, or in any dynamic, when you look at the power structure in place, and this is what Dr. Tommy Curry deals with in his book, The Man Not, the family was conceptualized in America, most particularly, with white men and white women serving as the symbolic heads of household. They were the father and the mother, right? And black folk were considered the children. Black men, most particularly, were conceptualized as weak and childlike, right? Despite maybe physical dominance in many areas, but weak and childlike as it pertained to the areas of the mind. So when you dealt with ethnologists, for example, all the way up to, you know, the early part of the 20th century, they regarded black men as weak. It's not until the mid 20th century that it really comes into fruition that we're criminals, we're rapists, we're violent. Now you see elements of that in the early 20th century, especially if you look at Birth of a Nation and whatnot. But when those concepts really took hold on the national imagination, it's closer to the mid 20th century. My point being that the perception of black men as something dangerous, something that needs to be done away with, controlled, even killed, if not incarcerated, that took some time. But the transition point from early on to the latter point, we came out of this framework of being perceived within the context of the white family. And in that dynamic, the black woman could be conceptualized as the trusted child, if you will, because she's in the home, she's suckling the children, she's got the responsibility of that, and she has a different relationship to the white male, right? I'm not saying it's a loving affair per se, but I am saying it's a different dynamic. We didn't have the same relationship with white men, by any means. So in that regard, the power dynamic is different. Black women were given charge of the slave cabin. They were given, if anything, we know that by law, the children's status as free or enslaved was based on her status. So she was given a modicum of power in relation to where black men stood. And I think that set the framework for how black men and women saw each other. And of course, like I said, earlier, this gets exacerbated by the time we get on, to different levels of policy, whether you're talking about World War II and the policies extended to, who were supposed to be widows, and then that kind of morphs into welfare and so on and so forth. Those kind of things begin to change the dynamic that much more, because at every stage, there have been varying degrees of black women not necessarily needing to rely on their men, but not necessarily because black men are inherently failures, but because systemically speaking, we are barred from being able to do so. And her standard for masculinity is not only an unbarred man, it's an elite white man. And those are two distinct things unto themselves. So I think all of that begins to play in how we relate to one another.
Wow, you said a mouthful right there, man. That's a lot. Well, thank you, BGS. I appreciate your help, man. Thank you for supporting us here. Yeah, if you like, man, please like, share, subscribe. But, so let me just put it this way, man. So you basically have said that there's a unique relationship that black women have with white men, white women, white boys, and girls. Okay? So black women, to some extent, were literally an extension of the white family in the ways that black men could never be. Right? So they're connected through what I would call, and what I think, Curry didn't formulate this idea. I think it was Errol Miller who did. But the idea is they're connected to the white family through generation, but not genealogy. Now, what that means is black women had children through the production of childbirth with white men. Okay, so that's generation. They were able to generate children with white men, and you can look at us in contradistinction to Native Africans, and you could tell that there's been race mixing amongst this population, the black population. It happened all the time. Okay. However, they were not an extension of the white family through genealogy. And genealogy has to do with endogamy. Okay, now I don't know if anyone has ever heard of the word endogamy, but endogamy essentially is the custom of marrying or mating or reproducing within the limits of a community, a clan, a tribe, or a race. Okay? So what that means is that it's cool for white men to have kids with black women, but it is absolutely intolerable for black men to reproduce with white women.
Mm-hmm.
Because white women and white men are the only ones that can produce more white babies. You can't get it, like, as soon as you start mixing with black folks, the whiteness is gone. Okay? Now, what's strange about it, though, is their blackness as women prevents them from being able to be inducted into clannish or kinship ties with white people.
Right.
Because the only thing that black women can produce in their wombs are more black babies, whether they be female or male. Okay? So this woman who knows that she's having children with white men, right, and was allowed to have, to some limited degree, some interaction with the white family in this attenuated way. She could give advice. I mean, to the people she suckled, okay? Uh-huh. But she could never raise these people into whiteness. Mm-hmm. You can't raise little Chad and Karen into white people. Only white people can do that. Mm-hmm. Okay? That's something that's important to understand. You can't enculturate white folks into whiteness. So the very people that you give birth to, you treat differently than the people that you rear inside of the white household. What kind of psychological effect or impact would that have on her relationship, not only to white men and women and children, but to black men, women, and children? Would there be any cultural effect related to this that creates some sort of bifurcation in the psyche? Some sort of, disjointed loyalty, or, some sort of, I don't know, some sort of psychic rift. What do you think about that, bro?
You talking about a psychic rift initiated by a black woman's position, or?
Correct.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting from one vantage point. You got kids that are your biological offspring with another black man that are already limited in where they can go and what they can do. And then you got these symbolic children that you're raising in a white household, or at least you have the illusion of rearing, right? To some extent, you feed them, you suckle them, those kind. And when they're really little, you can give them direction, you can discipline them to some extent. You know what I mean? But how that splits up, has to be fairly jarring in and of itself, knowing full well that your own children aren't going to be able to participate. And I wonder if that in and of itself produces a degree of hostility toward black men, just knowing full off there that your offspring with black men are already limited. Does it produce that? I think it's a worthy question.
People in the chat, man, why don't you answer that question and give us some insight and tell us what you think, man? I'm confused, because I'm not a black woman. I don't know what they think, but we can get some insight into what they think by what they write and what they discuss and what they talk about. So I want to share the screen, man, but my browser shut down, so I'm going to have to pull this up again. And let me pull up the tabs for this thing, man, and share this. Well, maybe I have to go all the way back to my
Can I say something real quick while you do that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just to point out that, even if we look at the post or really the welfare era from the 60s on, for example, one of the things I think we do see is an increase in hostility toward black men as especially in regard to the rise of the carceral state, the impact of low level employment, industrial deindustrialization. I think the hostility levels that black men ever been reporting on since the 70s, but especially since the 80s, are a reflection of what black men are not perceived to be able to do the way other groups of men are. So I think that this precedent for there being hostility toward black men in relation to access to society is something we've even seen in the last 50 years. So I don't think it's a far stretch to see that happening during an earlier era. But just wanted to add that to that.
Okay, man, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I got this article and I want to share it, bro. It's a black woman. I assume that it's on the screen right now.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, let me close this part of it and then minimize it so more of it could be seen on the screen.
Okay.
I don't know if it's legible. It should be.
I can't really read it, but that's me. I could see it a little better earlier.
Okay, so let me expand it then. Okay, so the name of this article is written by some woman who calls herself the Academic Hustler 1975. I'm assuming she's in her late 40s, okay? And I'm also assuming that she's either an academician or she's somebody that, thinks that looking into academia is a way to get answers to social problems related to black folks, okay? Especially black women. So I also assume that she's a feminist because many of the people that she quotes here are feminists, okay?
Okay.
All right, so she begins by saying something like this. Much of the writings about the challenges of marriage and the role of wife have been single lens studies about white middle-class women, even though they're not always marked as such. So the idea about what's challenging about marriage is often characterized from the framework or from the perspective of white women and not black women. Okay, so that's the first thing she says, all right, or at least the first, thesis statement that she puts forward, about black marriages, okay, or black marriage life. And she says she came across a great article that speaks on black marriages. She's not married, but she belongs to a few groups with married folks. And she wants to get insight on different aspects into marriage and what's needed to maintain a good one, and when it's not enough, and divorce is the only option. And she says she believes that every black woman grows up with an image of them meeting the person of their dreams, picturing themselves walking down the aisle and looking into the eyes of their best friend in life and love. And she says, I always thought that and craved that at one time, kissed many frogs and dated many fish, but none that quite fit into that dream of mine. Okay, now first of all, let me say this. Do you actually think that most women who are black have this idea that they're going to find their Prince Charming and he's going to sweep them up off of their feet and that this person is going to be her soulmate in life and love and it's going to be some sort of perfect pairing? Do you think they believe this?
I would actually break that down generationally, because I think up until Gen X, there was some idea that. I don't think the later generations have that. I really don't. But I do think up through Gen X, I think they had that idea that they were going to meet him, and it was kind of merged with some very problematic ideas, right? Because that's the generation I hear everybody wants to emulate in terms of the Jay-Z, Beyonce effect, right? So they're Mr. Right by the time they become adults. Their Mr. Right becomes the co-baller, right? And they want to be the power couple. And I think that's the power couple is, the adult idea behind what you're describing. But I think the last generation to really invest in that were Gen X. That's just my humble opinion, though.
So after the 60s and 70s, the Gen X generation was the last generation to think, okay, I'm going to meet somebody who's going to sweep me up off my feet. We're going to have a family. We're going to have children. We're going to build a legacy. But the next generation after that, the millennials just said, no, this is not what I envisioned for myself. This is not something that I'm actively pursuing.
Well, I think by the time you saw the drop in marriage, by the time we saw the increased rise in this independent idea and really the falling apart of this idea of the married nuclear family, I think that's where it begins to diminish with future generations. With our generation, like ours was the first generation really raised under a single parent rule, but there was still this idea that girls could find a partner and all of that jazz. But this was ironic because you're talking about a generation of women that really didn't understand men and hadn't been around them. I mean, that's the ours is the first generation where you didn't where you actually had fathers leaving the household. And my argument has been starting in the mid 70s that there's been a silent protest on behalf of men. You know what I mean? And I wrote a blog piece to this effect where I tried to explain that and put it in the context because we always heard it presented as the deadbeat dad. That's what we were told. We ours was the generation of the deadbeat dads, and the fallout of that is girls and boys growing up without their fathers. Boys don't really know what manhood is. We had a million rappers talking about the impact of their fathers not being there, and then girls, kind of idolize a certain idea of black manhood to the point it was just unfathomably unrealistic. But at the end of the day, I think instead of it being a deadbeat dad dynamic, I think a lot of men were starting to recognize what was going on, even as early as the early 1970s, because we started to see the shift in policy. We started to see the rise of the family court. We started to see child support being implemented. We started to see the impact of birth control and how much power it gave the average woman over who she wanted to reproduce with and who she didn't, and how she could use that at different points. Even during my lifetime, I remember when women would tell young men, "Oh, don't worry about that. I'm on the pill." And if she wanted to stop taking it or she had that power. Now you could continue to wear a condom, but what I'm saying is, with the rise of the pill, she had unprecedented access, in terms of control of her body. She had tools she could use before, during, and after the sex act. So I'm saying, with all of these new changes in place that are happening, at breakneck pace from the 60s through the 80s, I think it just had a profound effect. And I think many men, black men most particularly, because it took white men several decades later to kind of catch on, black men started to walk away. And I think this impacted the family dynamic that much further.
Man, that's saying a mouthful. I mean, to surmise that, ultimately, what you're saying is that the policies sprang forth that gave women an inordinate amount of power in regulating and managing family life, whether or not they want to continue a relationship or end one, whether or not they're going to allow the man that they had a child with to actually be an integral part of that kid's life and the way that kid was going to be sustained. But also there was the emergence of all these birth control options that women had that gave them more power in their own sexual lives. Mm-hmm. So they were no longer restricted, and had to be careful related to who they slept with, because now there were a whole set of new options just based on technology.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We went from an era where if a girl got pregnant, especially before, she finished high school, the attitude was she could have kept her legs closed. Within a 10-year period, that shifted to where, she could decide if she wanted to have the child. And if she decided the next 18 years of your life were in her hands, and it was your fault because you should have worn a condom. Like the language, the perspective shifted because of the impact of technology, but it wasn't in a manner that actually made women more accountable. It was in a manner that shifted the critique from women to men. That's just, yeah.
So I'm not looking at what's going on in StreamYard or YouTube right now, but I heard a donation. Thank you to whoever you may be. Maybe perhaps
Scorpion Black made the donation.
Well, thank you, Scorpion, man. You got to hold that down for me because I can't see anything in StreamYard right now.
So you got that, and you got Mr. Meach made a donation as well.
Thank you, Mr. Meach. Appreciate that.
And Kwame Triple X.
Thank you, Kwame Triple X. Appreciate that.
You got Angel Girl, and you got Freetown Marketer, I think it is, made donations as well, and Michael Ross.
Thank each and every one of you. I appreciate it. Again, man, I'm the G with a PhD. I'm joined today by Dr. Tiasan Johnson. And, we're here to have an open and a candid conversation, from a black male perspective. and a perspective which is oftentimes suppressed, disregarded, or often characterized as anti-black woman, or just absolutely ridiculous utterings to begin with, because of course black men don't know what the hell they're talking about, right? Their opinions really don't matter. They,
Right.
why register their opinions, because they really don't matter anyway.
Right.
But at any rate, going on with this, she gives a quote from Patricia Hill Collins, and I find a lot of times that black feminist authors oftentimes piggyback upon the concepts put forth by white women, and a lot of those claims to me are unsubstantiated to begin with, whether they be from a social scientific perspective or not. Okay, I think much of feminism is ideological and not necessarily scientific, even though they claim that it is. I mean, Patricia Hill Collins is a sociologist, but she's a feminist sociologist, so much of her work is shot through with some of these utterings and just assumptions that are never challenged or critiqued. All right, and here's one such claim: black women likely do all the emotion management that white women do, including making sure that the relationship thrives.
Wow.
I mean, just think about this. In other words, black women are doing all of this work to make sure the relationship works, but black men are doing nothing.
Yeah, we're watching the game.
We're watching the game. We're hanging out with the boys. We're having affairs. We're making sure that we can, get as much of the goodies as we possibly can out of life. We make sure that she's stuck in the house barefoot and pregnant, and she doesn't have a career life. She's working like a Hebrew slave, pun intended. And men are just kind of loafing and goofing off like little boys.
Right.
That's what this sounds like to me.
It is. And
it's
narcissistic
to me,
as hell.
I think it is. Okay, but then she goes on even further to say this may include overlooking behavior that undermines women's happiness. Black women are taught to accept men's tendencies to date multiple women, acts of infidelity, and other negative behavior as boys being boys. Okay, okay, so men, they're typically not denigrated as much as women who are, going around hoeing. Okay, we know this. Okay, so it's a different kind of stereotype for men than it is for women as it pertains to sexual openness. Okay, but at the same time, I mean, you got a lot of black men who are being manipulated in the context of relationships. They're not having fulfilling marriages or just relationships in general, because they're dealing with abuse from their female partners. I mean, to just say that it's culturally accepted for men to abuse women in the context of relationships, and that there's nothing in return that is occurring, to me it smacks of narcissism and just outright neglect of what men go through. They are not even trying to register what men go through in the context of intimate partner relationships.
No, they're creating a narrative that positions them as the sacrificial hero that has to do all the work because they're unloved, unappreciated, so on and so forth. But not only is there, really no accountability. You know what else is missing? There's no understanding of the impact of the sexual marketplace. The sexual marketplace value is not a part of their framework. So we got a lack of accountability. We have a misunderstanding of the sexual marketplace in terms of how men and women treat each other and engage each other, especially over time, across age. All of those things are missing in sacrifice for this virtue signaling narrative of I am the long-suffering Christ figure. See, what I was going to say earlier, you and Dr. Neal are in a better position than I to say whether or not this has moved from ideology to religion. Because my suspicion is it's gotten to be a religion. We talk about feminism, especially post second wave, third wave. I think we've reached religious proportions, but you could say better than I.
Personally, I think that some people treat it like a religion, but I don't think it's absolutely a religion. I just think that, it's a political perspective, and there are people who are radical in their professing and their acceptance of this political orientation and ideology. And I also think that when it's critiqued, which any discipline should be able to be critiqued, and it should be welcomed, okay? It doesn't matter what discipline it is, whether it's African American studies or whether it's feminist studies, women and gender studies, okay? Whether it's fat studies or LGBTQ studies, okay? There's nothing inviolable about a person making a claim, a fact claim, or a political claim or a philosophical argument. They're all, especially in academia, they all are subjected or ought to be subjected to critique. But it seems as if this particular brand of thinking is not amenable to critique at all. And this is what frustrates me about it. Okay. And when you do on occasion just so happen to critique it, it gets reduced to misogyny or misogynoir. So we can't even have the conversation, and we can't even be open and candid. We have to be politically correct.
Shout out to T Fitness for you for the donation.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Appreciate that.
And that's why I considered it religious in its orientation. It's the narrative that can't be questioned. One of the things I noticed over the last 20 years when it came to women and gender studies is feminism is the only underlying rubric ideology that's considered acceptable. I've never seen another field operate quite that way. I mean, you got so many branches of, even if you talk about philosophy, really, there are branches of it that fundamentally disagree on a number of things. But one of the things I see holding consistent across this field is not only the narrative of women as the long-suffering, figure, but this idea that feminism isn't to be debated. It's assumed. And then we have a discussion on top of what's assumed. So if you come in questioning the base, you're already considered out of place. You're already considered inherently misogynistic because you're not supposed to question feminism.
And that's where we have an issue, and I think that's what a lot of black men have an issue with in the context of the interpartner relationships. It's like, for some reason nowadays, man, you can't tell a woman shit. I hate to say this, man. You can't tell them shit, bro.
No.
And as soon as you start to tell them some shit, it's like you have to be deferential while you tell them.
Yeah.
You have to take away the sting of what it is that you're saying. You have to be sensitive. You can't be direct, and you can't, use any candor. You have to put the gloves on every time you talk to a woman. And it's like, wait a minute, man.
You know who you have to be? You have to be Mark Lamont Hill.
No, you got to be Ralph Tresvant, man. I wish I had a sound
like
Ralph to use for that.
No,
You need a man with sensitivity, a man like me. Oh man, that's crazy, man. But and here's the weird thing about it, man. Women don't even like men like that. This is the weird thing about it, man. And there's studies that have been done on this. Women do not like men who are overly sensitive and who just buckle to their every demand. They don't like them.
Across race, you're right.
This is just the weirdest phenomenon. Okay, and I think that. Let me just go ahead with this, man, because I want to get through it because we only got like maybe 40 or 38 minutes or so before we move over to your format, okay? All right, so she goes on to say, as a 40-year-old woman, those dreams are no longer cravings, to get married, okay? Mm-hmm. I'm not rushing to find that perfect person or situation where I will be happy for the rest of my life, okay? And first of all, who said that marriage is supposed to be that perfect situation with a perfect person that'll make you happy for the rest of your life? Like, this notion of happiness arising from marriage is quixotic. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I think that, this is more in line with fairy tale notions about what marriage and love is, as opposed to the reality, the social reality. and the real conditions that are supposed to exist amongst men and women to sustain not only relationships with each other, but for, the ongoing edification of their progeny, the ongoing education and the psychological, spiritual, and, just educational well-being of their own children, man. But at any rate, she says the reality of people is what I focus on, and we are all perfectly flawed. That's what we need to be getting at. And I think at least she's willing to admit that. But we already know going in that everybody is flawed. There is no perfect person walking the earth, man.
But I think she pays lip service to that concept, really.
I think so too, yeah.
But in the other element of marriage that nobody wants to talk about now, that many religions used to emphasize as well, is duty. That's not a popular conversation to have in this era, because it presupposes that women have to do something. Now, they're comfortable with duty as it pertains to men providing, protecting, so on and so forth. But duty is one-sided at this point. So when you raise duty in relationship to marriage, it's a non-starter. You're not supposed to have that conversation as long as it means that she's obligated to do something she doesn't feel like doing.
And not only that, man, it's not just the emotional labor that they're supposedly forced to perform, because it has to be forced, right? It's also the labor in the context of the home itself, which they say men don't do. Like, men don't change diapers. Men don't go get bottles and feed the children. Men don't stay up with the kids and love them the way she loves them. I mean, look, this is the thing that has me tripped out, man. BGS did a show on this the other day, man, and he talked about equality and equity. Okay. Yeah. And he is, man, truly a self-made, intellectual. Okay. He's one of those erudite guys who, actually takes the time out to understand concepts and to present them so that lay people can understand them. He's a public intellectual. Okay. But in my view, look, this is something that's different. Like, today we live in a postmodern culture. So what I mean by, and I can't explain it the way BGS can explain it without being professorial, but I'll take a stab at it. Okay. With the modern culture, you got this idea of liberty, which is different from the idea of liberty from the ancients. Ancients had an idea about liberty that had to do with duty and with obligation and self-realization and the fulfillment of roles, right? Meaning that you're a part of a whole. You're not the sum total of everything.
Right.
It doesn't start in yourself. It starts in your relationship to others. That's where freedom is to be found. But in this culture, after modernity, the whole idea is that freedom is just you doing whatever it is that you would like to do. Okay, that's what freedom consists in. Not being obstructed from being able to do whatever it is you want to do. Okay? And to me, that's just a bankrupt concept of what freedom is like and what it's about. Okay, but that's just my opinion. And then when it comes down to equality and equity, so the presupposition is laid out by both conservatives and liberals in the American political spectrum that equality is a good thing. But they don't know how to actually get at it. So there's some people who say that we need equity, meaning that there's we must do as much as we can to redress the shortcomings of birth or environment. And then there are another group of people who say, look, we just need to treat everybody formally, equally. And that way we don't have to go into, all of this detailed involvement as to who gets what, predicated to who had what environment or who had what kind of condition of birth, right? It's just that we treat everybody the same. There's an equal standard for everybody. There's no, set asides. There's no, readjusting for all kind of, misfortunate circumstances. It's everybody just gets treated like exactly the same. Now, My thing is this. The ancients were able to do both of these to some degree, but only in an attenuated way. Because in the ancient cultures, there were no big bureaucracies that meddled into interpersonal lives between people the way that we have now. It just didn't exist. You didn't have these kind of infrastructures. But now you have all these bureaucracies, and they're meddling into people's lives and preventing natural charity from taking place. Because if you know somebody, you can determine whether or not they're worthy of actually being deserving of help. But you can't do that in a society where you got millions of people. How can you possibly know what somebody deserves or what they don't deserve unless you actually are intimately connected to them? And this is what happens when you have these big kind of cultures. But that's a sidebar, man. I think I'm getting too much off a topic. But at the end of the day, what I want to say is this about it, okay? Fate spins a thread, man. And another thing the ancients knew is that there was a such thing called fate, okay? And some people are better looking than other people. Some people are more talented intellectually than some other people. And there's a whole host of factors that could come into play that determine the outcome of your life that you have no control over. Like, I have no control over the fact that, like, I'm 6'3". I can't control that. It was just the luck of the draw.
Right.
Okay. Now, the question is, what is permissible in terms of redressing related to misfortune and what is not? Because you can't redress for being ugly. You can't give somebody money or resources or give them a better shot at finding what they want in a dating life the same way you can with something like, say, for example, born into poverty, right? Because poverty is something that runs across populations. And ugliness is too, I guess. I mean, to a certain measure. Damn, Doc, I'm not trying to be funny here, man.
Yeah, shout out to Barry Little for the donation, man.
Thank you, Barry Little, man. I'm not trying to be funny here, Doc. Like, but this puts us in a quagmire. Equity creates all kinds of quagmires, okay? Because then you have to deal with what is it you're going to redress for, and what are you not going to redress for? What are you not going to adjust for? And this is what Thomas Sowell brought forward, man. He wrote a great book about this called The Quest for Cosmic Justice. Okay? And, you got some pretty simple things here, man, that you can adjust for. You could adjust for sex, okay, and gender or whatever the case may be. I think we've already done that, though. That's just my opinion, but we don't think we've done it because people don't have the same outcomes. But my guess is that you'll never have the same outcomes between men and women. You'll never get there. Because women have different kind of directions that they move towards in their lives, whether they're restricted or whether they're channeled into it. And even when they're not channeled into it, they still go for it and direct themselves towards things autonomously that would be considered to be traditional roles that women fulfill. Like, they did this shit in Norway, bro. Like, okay, well, everybody's going to get the same education. We're going to give everybody the same colors as kids. There'll be no differentiation between boys and girls at the earliest levels of education and social incorporation. At the end of the day, more women went into fields in that society that were traditionally associated with women than at damn near any time in that country's history. Which basically is an empirical study establishing the fact that men and women, we're hardwired differently, man. We have different interests.
Right.
We see the world through different lenses. Now, they're willing to accept that they see the world through different lenses as it, as it pertains to their quote unquote oppression, but they are never attuned to the privileges and to, the kind of different treatment that they receive that's partial to them. And that's what men take, exception with and take pause with. It's like you don't see the benefits that you have, but you see all the burdens that you have.
Right.
You only see, the glass like these women are eternal pessimists. It's like you don't ever see what it is that you're receiving that's a benefit. But I think that they know the benefits that they receive. They just want to hang on to those and be obviated from the duties associated with actually being able to hold on to those privileges. That's my view on it, bro.
Well, and that goes back to what BGS was also talking about in that video in regard to the burden of performance, right? The sacrifices made in the first place have a lot to do with what outcomes people get. And if at the end of the day, you don't want to be anything from ditch diggers to soldiers on the battlefield, you can't be upset with the outcomes being different. You know what I mean? Men tend to be, men find themselves on both sides of the equation. Yes, they tend to be more wealthy on one end, but they also tend to be more impoverished on another. They tend to live well on one end, and they tend to be more the homeless on the other. Men constitute the extremes in the spectrum more so than women. Women congregate in the middle, but they want extreme outcomes without the sacrifice of that. So, you know, you want to be the CEOs, but you don't want to be the janitors. Okay, well, that doesn't work.
Yeah, and then also
like that.
Also, men are more obsessed with things than are women, as a whole. Okay, not and of course there are men who are like slackers and incompetence. Okay, but there are a lot of men who are motivated. One could argue possessed, in a sense, to perform in a certain way that women aren't as a whole. Okay, like when you start to do a bell curve and you look at the extremities in which you have men who are possessed versus women who are possessed to perform and to be at the top of a dominance hierarchy, more often than not, men are going to be those persons who are more possessed, right? In order to, you know, meet the demands to be at the top of some sort of hierarchy, right? Because men are more competitive, whereas women are more social and cooperative. Even feminists will admit this. But then they attribute this to the patriarchy rather than it having anything to do with the way men and women are hardwired differently, right? But
and you know, there's something real interesting in that too, because since I've been a child, one of the things I've always heard is that if men just step back and let women lead, everything would be great. If men just accepted that women's ways, shout out to Rashid Barnes for the donation. If men would just, you know, accept women's ways of leading, everything will be inherently better. But they didn't accept that there are benefits and drawbacks to any model, right? So one of the things we saw with BLM, for example, was the employment of that social leadership model that you kind of referenced a second ago. Women tend to be more social, but they tried to put that in a leadership format to demonstrate that we need to avoid hierarchy and roll with an everybody rules kind of dynamic. But what ended up happening? What did we see happen in that dynamic in regard to BLM in the last 6 years? The lack of leadership became a problem. The lack of a clear agenda that was articulated from one position became a problem. And then when resources got into the mix, it blew up. And you still have chapters asking where the money is, asking for transparency. Meanwhile, you got certain people who are espousing these ideas of a social equal leadership model, and yet they're buying mansions and other people can't pay their rent. So there are problems on either side of this dynamic, but women have not wanted to be honest about the drawbacks to their social approach while being hypercritical of what men tend to do.
Yeah, but let me get to some of the quotes that she uses. Her personal narrative ends like this: as a black woman, I already have several things that I deal with because I'm black and I'm a woman. There's the intersectionality there.
Yep.
So I'm doubly oppressed. Okay.
No data.
Marriage was supposed to be my salvation. My completed meaning of life, and the person I married was supposed to be that person that makes my hardships a little less hard. As if marriage is not a work-related institution.
Right.
It's not. This is the thing that screws my head up, man, in a million different pieces, bro.
Yeah.
Like, marriage is work, man. This is like family life is work life. It doesn't sustain itself. Okay, food has to be cooked. And men, like black men, are among the most progressive men in related to sharing duties in the household. Not white men, not Latino men, but black men. So this is confusing to me. So this is Moynihan scissors, but it's not Moynihan scissors. Call it green gorilla scissors. Because it's funny as you have a group of men who increasingly believe that household duties are supposed to be shared, who are more present in the lives of their children than other groups of men who are more involved, right? As much as they potentially or possibly can be, right? These groups of men are found as less desirable. You would think that black women would be like, oh man, we got the greatest men in the U.S. related to these equity issues, okay? But instead of, saying that, they're like, okay, well, black men are worse.
Right.
They're even more terrible because they're trying to reproduce patriarchal structures. My view on it is, look, if you even go back, and this is the conversation I had that you weren't present for when the stream began, even in classical African civilization, and I'm not saying we have to reproduce that, but you had mononuclear families. They weren't just, a group of women in clans bonding together and taking care of the children in a community-based kind of environment, man. It wasn't like that. Mm-hmm. You have familial units where you had a man there, a woman there, and children there. You didn't have, you might have had, if one was, sick or reaching, the point of death, you might have had a grandmother there or elderly person there. But primarily it was monadic familial units. And you can see this in a whole host of different cultures and societies, okay? It's not just American white culture. I don't know where these women are coming up with that, the relationship between men and women is all patterned after white patriarchy, because there are other examples in which these kind of relationships and institutions have persisted that have nothing to do with white patriarchy. So this is what confuses me about this, but they keep referring to it as if it's a given. But that's why I put, Osiris, Isis, and Horus into the picture. It's like, okay, here you have a family with the man in the middle, who's the king, the wife who's the queen, and the son who's the prince who eventually takes over the kingdom. Okay? This is what you see. And it's a cultural myth, of course, and that's all I perceive it as. It's a myth. It's a symbolic representation of how to live a life, okay? It's something that you can pattern your own life of and give your life meaning cosmologically, okay? But that's all gone now. Like, in this culture, it's all about being a mom. And that goes back to the point of this show. Black women don't have any concept of being a wife. To them, being a wife is doing emotional work that's extreme, whereas the men do none. And it's a kind of institution where they feel like all of their dreams will be fulfilled in the context of it, and that there's actually no work to be done there. And that when there is work to be done there, I'll be damned if I'm going to do the vast majority of it, or even acknowledge the kind of work that he does within it. It's all just from my perspective, I'm getting the raw deal. And they never, take the time to register how men feel about this.
But it's also based on a misnomer. If anybody looked at Warren Farrell's book, Myth of Male Power, one of the things he talks about is that early 1980s statement made about how much work women do in the household and how much men don't do. And one of the things he broke down is they cut out half of that report. It wasn't that men didn't do work. Men did different work, so they weren't washing dishes and cooking meals, but they were doing the lawn. They were, gassing the cars. They were doing masculine labor in the same household, but that got erased and it all became about being measured. Really what you did was you measured men on being faulty women. And that's the narrative they've actually been able to still use in regard to this notion of whether or not men contribute to the household. It's not that they don't. They always have. And when you point out that black men are even more progressive than others, what that actually means is black men are doing the masculine work and they're helping with what we call the feminine work, more so than other groups.
I'm just ready for them to start mowing the lawn, washing the car, changing the tires, making sure that oil is straight. But look, these are things that
in the night. Yeah.
These are things women don't have an issue doing when they're by themselves. Or they go get a man to do it, like their daddy or their uncle or one of their brothers to do it. Or they pay somebody to do it. Okay? But I get your point. So there are men doing work in the context of the household, but it's different kind of work. It's just not female work or what has traditionally been associated with female work. You know, I've had women, man, ask me to put furniture together and shit. You know, not even for them, but for their extended family. Like, oh, he'll put the TV stand together while they sit back with their motherfucking legs wide open, not wide open, but I mean, you know, with their legs up on the you know, the ottoman and shit, eating food while I'm fucking sweating and using my, you know, intellectual power to put this shit together. I'm like, what am I getting out of this? A drink or some shit? Like a bottle of Jack or something? Some Coke? Like, what am I getting out of this, man? You know? And it's work that they won't do. A lot of them will not do this work. Like, yeah, let's put this together. Let's sit and puzzle and piece this together. They just don't do it, bro. I'm just keeping it 100 with you, man. I've seen it. I've had women call me, man, 7, 8 p.m., like they on one side of town, like my car just got a flat. Will you help me change it, please? Like, wait a minute. You know what I'm saying? I thought you were strong and independent. Like, changing the damn tire ain't that difficult, but I can see how it could be hard for a woman. But it ain't impossible for a woman.
Nah, the way it is now, it isn't that. But shout out to Grown Man Business. He just made a donation. I was just listening to him before the show started. So shout out to that brother.
Shout out to you, Grown Man. Shout out to all y'all. I just can't see it right now because I got my head buried in this article. Let's look at some of the things the quotes she has from these studies, because we're at the 15-minute mark and we got to cut off and go to your format. Black marriage. Studies always show that black marriages are difficult to maintain. The lack of marriageable black men and criticism about unwed black mothers. What do you think about that? First thing that comes to your mind.
But I didn't see it. I'm sorry. I was looking at something else. Go ahead. What was it?
Studies always show that black marriages are difficult to maintain. There's a lack of marriageable black men, and there's criticism about unwed black mothers.
The first thing that comes to my mind is this whole issue of lack of marriageable black men. I think there's a lot there that needs to be unpacked. And I think there's a lot of stereotypes in that narrative that people have gotten quite comfortable with and don't want to be accountable to. Go ahead. What were you thinking?
All I'm saying is, look, if you're an unwed black mother, you 40 years old, you got an attitude, and you're overweight, you're probably not going to find Prince fucking Charming.
Title.
I'm just saying, man. I ain't trying to be ignorant. But I'm just saying, you're probably not going to find the top echelon of men or the men that you consider to be the top echelon of men, which, by the way, if you come to think about it, is all predicated upon the white patriarchal idea about what good men are.
Yeah.
So at the same time, you hold us to these patriarchal standards about who and who's not a good man, but at the same time, you want to blame us for being patriarchal when we have all of that shit. I just don't understand it. It's confusing. It is all over the place. It's inconsistent. It's, duplicitous as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, let me go on. The emphasis on the oppression of black men in discussions of marriage markets and family troubles renders black women invisible, or worse, responsible.
Yep. And that's an argument we've heard, throughout the academy. If we deflect to dealing with black men, everybody else suffers. Black women, black children, LGBT, everybody suffers.
This I will say. Men are responsible for childbirth with women as well because they can't get pregnant by themselves, okay? My whole thing is, at the end of the day, you got all these options and these choices you can make as women to have kids or not have kids. And before even going into thoughts about what would occur had you had a baby, you've already had it in your mind. This is me talking to black women. That it's okay for you to be a mother. You're okay with that social role. But you find it difficult and hard to reconcile motherhood in the context of a marriage. Which is one could argue is backwards culturally throughout the annals of time and history. The only times that this becomes normalized is during slave culture. I'm just being honest with this, man. This is slave culture, man. This whole notion of single motherhood and all of this is given birth to from slave culture, bro. And it's filtered into all other, demographics as well. But the question is it optimal in the long run? And does it make women happy in the long run? Because they're complaining about how difficult it is to be a single mother.
Right.
My question is, okay, look, if it's so difficult for you to be a single mother, think twice before becoming a mother. And then not only that, think again about what you think marriage is supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be the locus of happiness for all times. Like presto changeo. I got married, abracadabra. Now I got a perfect life. Your marriage is going to be as good as the energy and effort you put into it. And then also you have to begin to understand how men operate. And men have to understand how women operate. But this is just not, men and women are not exactly the same. And this is what we want to basically make everybody flat the same. Like everybody has the same obligations and duties and responsibilities and roles. That's not going to work, man. It's never going to work.
But I think that's why they really have a problem with the sexual marketplace discussion being brought in, particularly by men, in a very unapologetic manner, because it holds them accountable. So the whole bullet point you read about women not being discussed in marriage market discussions. Well, the problem is for them now that women are being discussed, but we're discussing it in a language that they don't want to discuss it in. So they want to use it as a shaming tactic to browbeat black men. But when you start talking about sexual marketplace value and both groups having to compete in that market, it becomes a problem. Because now there has to be accountability.
Right on. Next quote. Disproportionate numbers of black women will have no marriage at all. As Ridgway and Krikeli Klatz suggest, black women's failure to live up to dominant white femininity makes them less marriageable than white and Asian women and also black men.
As much as I agree that there are material issues, policy-based issues that got to be taken into account, the lack of critique, lack of critical self-reflection is in the narcissism that we see in this piece and in the culture of many black women is at the root of this. It's at the root of this.
Gender organizes the institution of heterosexual marriage as it does social life by placing women and men in unequal relationship to one another. I'll comment on this. Men and women are not exactly the same. Their expectations and their roles cannot be exactly the same. Imagine 5 basketball players and they're all centers. Imagine a football team and everybody's on the team in the position of running back. Imagine that everybody's a kick returner or that everybody's a safety. How does the team look?
The irony is they're good with roles as long as the roles work in their favor. I mean, you've heard the phrase, right? My money is my money, your money is our money. They don't have a problem with roles and they don't have a problem with compartmentalizing things, even in the family structure, as long as they're in the decision-making position.
And we have to acknowledge here, which many women don't, that owing to the social institutions and bureaucracies and the legal system in the United States, we effectively have a gynocracy. Women have complete and arbitrary control over the lives of children in the black community. Yeah. That's apparent. It's obvious. And to argue that there's some sort of inequality that only tips, the male way or the black male way is absolutely fucking ridiculous. It's insane to me that you would have a group of women who have arbitrary power over children, the capacity and the ability to cleave themselves off from men, and to make it difficult for that man to have involvement with the life of their child just by manipulating and pulling strings within the legal system. right? To argue that men have the advantage there is ridiculous. And this is what men are talking about. Even white men are talking about this, how the system is slanted in behalf of women. And it's ridiculous. Like, this is coming only from one standpoint. I can't read all of these, but let's go through two more and then we'll close out.
Shout out to J3 for the donation.
Shout out to you, J3. Placing the blame for the state of black marriage on the very people who are given the difficult task of protecting it from a variety of external assaults that stem from structured racism is not just unfair. It also diverts attention from the real culprit, the patriarchal and racist institution of marriage. I'm like, what the fuck is that, bro? Like, look, marriage is a ubiquitous institution. It's not just endemic to white culture or racist culture. It's not. It's been around for millennia. The question is, what is happening in black culture at this moment that makes it such that men and women can't get along with each other? Black men and women can't get along with each other in order to form lifelong partnerships, which people have been able to do throughout the annals of time. Okay? And like I said, I use Kemet as the standard precisely because women could get divorced in Kemetic culture. Okay? And typically the children went with them if they divorced their husbands. Okay? However, divorce was rare in that culture. It wasn't like, I don't like that nigga no more. Fuck that nigga. He ain't do what I wanted him to do. Okay, I'm going to fix this nigga. I'm going to take his ass to court.
Right.
That's not what you had. Okay, this is not the model that existed. Okay, and we can talk about the evil and the ominous patriarchy, but let's just be frank about it, man. The patriarchy is here as strong as it ever was. It ain't gone nowhere. There's not been a dent in it. And when it does begin to fall away and crumble, guess who's going to be the very persons screaming and begging for it to come back?
Uh-oh.
You're going to want that patriarchy.
Uh-oh.
You're gonna need, right now the state is the patriarchy.
Yes, sir.
That's the only reason you got these arguments about the patriarchy at the current moment, because you have impersonal bureaucracies which are performing the functions of patriarchy without actually having any kind of, day-to-day discretion, related to how you govern and regulate your life. But like, we want an outcome without doing the work to get the outcome. So that goes back to the BGS show, The Burden of Performance, man. If you want an outcome that's optimal, and if you want something that's actually functional, you have to work for it. The same way you have to maintain a vehicle, you have to maintain a relationship. You can't just get in the motherfucking car and roll it till the wheels off and fall off and just put some gas in it. You got to oil the tires. You got to change the window wiper blades. You got to, put new filters in there. You got to make sure that the Freon and in the AC system is operating the way it should. You got to put antifreeze in the radiator and a whole bunch of shit. You can't just drive a car without performing maintenance on it and expect for it to perform like a top fucking, tier vehicle.
Hold on. Look, not only shout out to Jasmine 4517. I gotta go set up, brother. So I gotta transition now, but I'll see you in a minute, okay?
All right, my brother, man. Thank you, Tia Son Johnson, for coming through, man. Right. And so I'm about to break off, so you can go ahead and get prepared, and I'll be right with you in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, because we're gonna pick up here, so I hope people transition with us. But all right.
Yeah. So at any rate, man, transition to Dr. Tia Son Johnson's page, YouTube page at Dr. Tia Son Johnson, and we're going to get more into this. But from a different perspective and a different angle. All right. So at the end of the day, man, we're having these conversations from black men's perspective. And it's not just women who are able to weigh in. It's men also who are weighing in. My viewpoint on it is, look, men and women are not the same. They're not going to perform the same jobs and the same roles in the household as women. And we shouldn't be expected to. Man, I had a woman, man, who had my child, who was upset at me because I wasn't up in the middle of the night breastfeeding the baby. What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck? Anyway, man, I'm about to break wide, man. See me over on Dr. Tiasan Johnson's page, man. Thank you so much, and so many shouts out go out to the people who have donated. Appreciate all of y'all. I'll see you on the next one, man. Yeah, follow me on Doc Johnson, man. Holla at y'all. Peace.